Thomas Calder stood at the edge of the Blackwater River, his calloused hands gripping the weathered fence post that marked the boundary of his family's land. The November wind cut through the Appalachian Valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. Behind him, the farmhouse loomed against the grey sky, its wooden boards darkened by centuries of rain and neglect. He was 32 years old, the eldest son of Samuel Calder, and he had just become a father for the first time. The year was 1935, and the Great Depression had squeezed the life out of most farming families in West Virginia. But the Calders had always endured. They had survived wars, famines, and economic collapses that had broken other families. The reason for their survival, whispered by neighbors in the nearby town of Davis, was a pact made long ago, a covenant with the river that required blood to maintain. Thomas had heard the stories since childhood. His grandfather had done it, his great-grandfather before him. Every eldest son in the Calder bloodline, stretching back 9 generations to when Ezekiel Calder first settled this land in 1702, had brought their firstborn to the river on the child's 7th day of life. They would wade into the cold water at dawn, hold the infant beneath the surface until the struggling stopped, and then release the small body to the current. By nightfall, the child would be gone, carried downstream to wherever the river took its offerings. In exchange, the river provided. Crops grew even in drought years. Livestock remained healthy when disease ravaged neighboring farms. The Calder men lived long lives, and their remaining children thrived. It was a grotesque bargain, but one that had sustained the family through 2 centuries of hardship. Thomas had grown up knowing that one day he would have to honor the covenant. He had accepted it the way other men accepted death and taxes, as inevitable parts of existence. But now, as he stood in the biting wind, his newborn son sleeping peacefully in the house behind him, Thomas felt something he had not anticipated. Doubt. His wife, Eleanor, had nearly died bringing the boy into the world. The labor had lasted 18 hours, and the midwife from town had warned that Eleanor might not survive another pregnancy. The child, whom they had named Daniel, was small but healthy, with his mother's dark eyes and a surprisingly strong grip. Thomas had held Daniel for the first time 3 days ago, feeling the infant's tiny fingers wrap around his thumb. In that moment, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He had expected to feel resignation, perhaps a grim determination to do what needed to be done. Instead, he felt an overwhelming protective instinct that terrified him with its intensity. This was his son, his blood. How could he willingly destroy that? The tradition had never been questioned. His father, Samuel, now 68 and still vigorous despite his age, had performed the ritual without hesitation. Samuel had fed Thomas's older brother, William, to the river in 1902. Thomas had never known William, never seen a photograph, or heard his name spoken with affection. The firstborn existed only to be given away. That was the way it had always been. But times were changing. The old ways were dying across America. Radio broadcasts brought news from distant cities. The federal government had established programs to help struggling families. Young people were leaving the mountains, seeking work in factories and offices where ancient covenants meant nothing. Thomas had considered leaving himself, back when he was younger and unmarried, but the land had a hold on him, just as it had held every Calder man before him. He turned away from the river and walked back toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Eleanor moving about, preparing the evening meal. She knew what was expected. They had never discussed it directly, but she had grown up in these mountains. She understood how things worked in families like the Calders. In 4 days, on Daniel's 7th dawn, Thomas would be expected to carry his son to the river. As he climbed the porch steps, Thomas made a decision that would shatter 200 years of tradition. He would not do it. He would refuse the offering. Whatever consequences followed, whatever price the river demanded, he would pay it. But he would not murder his son. The farmhouse door creaked as he entered, and Eleanor looked up from the stove. She saw something in his face, something that made her set down the wooden spoon she had been holding. Thomas crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his. No words were necessary. She understood immediately what he had decided, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. Relief, fear, and love mixed together in her expression. Outside, the Blackwater River continued its ancient flow through the valley, cold and patient and hungry. Samuel Calder knew something was wrong the moment he saw his son's face at breakfast the next morning. Thomas sat at the scarred oak table, pushing fried potatoes around his plate without eating. His jaw set in a way Samuel recognized. It was the look of a man preparing for confrontation. Samuel had seen that expression on his own father's face decades ago and on his grandfather's before that. Stubbornness ran in the Calder blood, though it had never been directed at the Covenant. The kitchen was warm, despite the November cold outside, heated by the cast-iron stove that had served 3 generations of Calders. Eleanor moved quietly between the counter and table, serving coffee and biscuits, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. The baby, Daniel, slept in a wooden cradle near the fireplace, wrapped in quilts Eleanor had sewn during her pregnancy. Samuel watched his daughter-in-law's hands tremble slightly as she poured his coffee. 4 days left, Samuel said, breaking the silence. His voice was gravelly from decades of pipe smoking, but still strong. He didn't phrase it as a question. There was no need. Thomas looked up from his plate. "I need to talk to you, Pa. Outside." They put on their coats and walked out to the barn, a structure as old as the house itself. The November sun was weak, barely warming the frost-covered ground. Inside the barn, 2 dairy cows and a plough horse occupied their stalls, chewing hay contentedly. Samuel leaned against a support beam, waiting. He had raised 5 children after sacrificing his firstborn, and he knew each of them well enough to sense trouble. "I'm not going to do it," Thomas said. The words came out flat, final. "I'm not taking Daniel to the river." Samuel had expected many things, but not this. In 233 years, no Calder man had ever refused the offering. The tradition was as immutable as the mountains themselves. He stared at his son, searching for signs of temporary madness or illness that might explain such a statement. "You don't know what you're saying," Samuel replied carefully. "The covenant isn't something we can just ignore, Thomas. It's kept this family alive for generations. It's murder. Pa, plain and simple. I held my son in my arms and I can't do it. I won't." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, hot and acidic. "You think I wanted to do it? You think any of us wanted it? Your grandfather, your great-grandfather, all the way back to Ezekiel, none of them wanted it. But they understood necessity. They understood survival." "Survival at what cost?" Thomas shot back. "How many children have died in that river? How many infants have we drowned for some imaginary protection?" "Imaginary?" Samuel's voice rose. "Look around you, boy. This farm has prospered when others failed. During the panic of 1893, farms all through this valley went under. Banks foreclosed on good families who'd worked this land for generations. But not us. Never us. When the blight hit the corn crops in 1921, we lost maybe 10% of our harvest while the Hendersons lost everything. That's not imagination. That's the covenant working." Thomas shook his head. "That's coincidence. Good land management. Luck, maybe, but not some pact with a river." "It's not the river itself," Samuel said, struggling to maintain his composure. "It's what lives in the river, what's always lived there. Ezekiel Calder saw it when he first came to this valley. It spoke to him, made him an offer. Prosperity and protection in exchange for tribute. 1 child every generation. That was the price, and Ezekiel paid it. Every Calder since has honored that bargain." "Did you ever see this thing?" Thomas asked. "Did grandfather? Or are we just following a story passed down so many times that nobody remembers if it was ever real?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. The truth was, he had never seen anything unusual in the river. He had performed the ritual as his father had instructed, wading into the cold water at dawn with baby William in his arms. He remembered the weight of his son, the way the infant had gasped when the water touched him, the horrible moment of holding him under, and then the release, watching the small body drift away on the current. It had been the worst moment of Samuel's life, but he had done it because it was necessary, because it was tradition. "I felt something," Samuel said finally, "when I was in the water. A presence, something old and powerful. It was watching me, Thomas, making sure I kept the bargain." Or maybe you felt guilt, Thomas suggested quietly. Maybe you felt like a father who had just killed his own child, and you needed to believe there was a reason for it. The words struck Samuel like a physical blow. He had spent 33 years telling himself the same thing, that William's death had meaning, that it had purchased safety for his other children. The alternative, that he had simply murdered his firstborn for no reason, was too horrible to contemplate. "If you don't honor the covenant," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "there will be consequences. The protection will end. The river will take what it's owed one way or another." "Then let it try," Thomas said. "I'd rather face whatever comes than kill my son." Samuel looked at his boy, no longer a boy really, but a grown man with his own family, and saw determination that would not be shaken. He recognized it because he had felt it himself once, long ago, before life had taught him the value of obedience to forces beyond human understanding. "You're making a mistake," Samuel said. "A terrible mistake that will cost more than just your own life." Thomas met his father's eyes. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." They stood in the cold barn, the distance between them suddenly much greater than a few feet of dirt floor. Eleanor Calder had not slept properly in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the river, dark and swirling, reaching up from her dreams to claim her son. She knew the stories as well as Thomas did. Every woman who married into the Calder family learned them, whispered by mothers-in-law and aunts in quiet moments. The firstborn always went to the water. That was the way of things. But Eleanor had also grown up in these mountains, and she knew other stories. Stories of women who had hidden their children, who had fled in the night with infants wrapped in blankets, who had chosen exile over sacrifice. None of those stories ended well. The women were always found, or they died in poverty in distant cities, or worse things happened. The river, it was said, always collected its due. She sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, Daniel sleeping against her chest. He was so small, barely 7 pounds, with delicate features that reminded her of her own mother. Eleanor had lost her mother to influenza when she was 12, and her father had drunk himself to death 3 years later. Thomas had been her salvation, offering her a home and a future when she had neither. She loved him with a fierce devotion that sometimes frightened her. The door opened and Thomas entered, stamping snow from his boots. It had started snowing an hour ago, light flurries that dusted the valley in white. He looked worn, older than his 32 years, with worry lines creasing his forehead. He crossed to Eleanor and kissed the top of her head, then gently touched Daniel's cheek with one rough finger. "I talked to Pa," he said quietly. "He's not happy." "I didn't expect he would be," Eleanor replied. "What did he say?" "That I'm making a mistake, that there will be consequences." Thomas sank into the chair opposite her. He talked about the covenant, about what it's meant to this family. "But Eleanor, I can't do it. I can't take our son to that river and drown him. I don't care what tradition says." Eleanor felt tears welling up again. She had cried more in the past week than in her entire adult life. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I love you for it. But Thomas, what if the stories are true? What if something really does happen?" "Then we'll face it," Thomas said firmly. "Together. We'll protect Daniel no matter what comes." A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas rose and opened it to find his younger brother, James, standing on the porch. James was 28, married to a schoolteacher from Elkins with 2 daughters of his own. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. "Pa sent me," James said without preamble. "He wants me to talk sense into you." "Did he tell you what we discussed?" Thomas asked. "He told me you're planning to break the covenant, that you won't take Daniel to the river." James looked troubled. "Thomas, you can't do this. You'll bring disaster on all of us." "It's my decision, James, my family." "It affects the whole family," James insisted. "The covenant protects all the Calders, not just you. If you break it, we all suffer the consequences." Eleanor stood, still holding Daniel. "What consequences? Has anyone ever actually tested this? Has any Calder refused before?" James shook his head. "No, because they understood what was at stake." "Or because they were too afraid to question it," Eleanor said. "James." This is our son, our baby. How would you feel if someone demanded you drown one of your daughters? It's not the same, James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm not the eldest son. The firstborn of the firstborn is what the river requires. Listen to yourself, Thomas said. You're talking about ritual murder like it's paying taxes. This is insane, James. It's been insane for 200 years and I'm ending it. James ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly conflicted. Pa said there's something in the river, something old. He felt it when he performed the ritual. Pa felt guilt, Thomas said, that's all. Guilt for killing his own child and needing to justify it. But what if he's right? James pressed. What if there really is something there, and you anger it by refusing? My daughters could be at risk. My wife. All of us. Then we'll deal with it, Thomas said, but I won't buy safety with my son's life. James stood silent for a long moment, looking between his brother and Eleanor, and finally at the sleeping infant in her arms. Something in his expression softened. I hope you know what you're doing, he said quietly. I really do. Because if you're wrong, we're all going to pay the price. After James left, Eleanor and Thomas sat together in silence, watching the snow fall outside the window. The 7th day was approaching rapidly. In 3 days, at dawn, Thomas would be expected to carry Daniel to the river. Instead, he would be barricading the doors and preparing to defend his family against whatever might come. Eleanor thought about her own mother, who had told her stories of the old ways before she died. Stories of sacrifices made to appease forces humans barely understood. Her mother had believed in those forces, had left offerings at certain places in the woods, had whispered prayers to things that predated Christianity by thousands of years. Eleanor had dismissed those beliefs as superstition, the remnants of ignorant times. But now, holding her son close, she wondered if her mother had known something she didn't. The mountains were old, older than human memory. Who knew what might lurk in their rivers and forests? Who knew what bargains might have been made in desperate times by desperate people? Thomas, she said softly, what if we left? Took Daniel and moved away from here. California, maybe, or Oregon, somewhere far from the river. Thomas considered this. Other Calders have tried that. My uncle Richard moved to Pennsylvania in 1910, trying to escape. He died 6 months later in a factory accident, crushed by machinery that shouldn't have been able to fall, and his children all died young of various causes. None of them made it to adulthood. That could have been coincidence, Eleanor said, but she didn't believe her own words. Maybe, Thomas agreed. But I don't think running is the answer. If this thing exists, if it has power, running won't save us. We face it here on our own land or we don't face it at all. Daniel stirred in Eleanor's arms, making small infant sounds. She looked down at his perfect face, his tiny hands, and felt a love so powerful it physically hurt. Whatever came, whatever price they had to pay, she would protect this child. They both would. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the valley in white, muffling the sound of the river as it flowed endlessly through the ancient darkness. The 6th day arrived with unseasonable cold. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and the Blackwater River had begun to freeze at its edges, forming thin shelves of ice that extended several feet from the banks. Thomas stood at the kitchen window before dawn, watching grey light creep across the valley. Tomorrow, by tradition, he should carry Daniel to the water. Instead, he had spent the previous evening reinforcing the doors and checking the locks on every window. Samuel had not returned to the house since their conversation in the barn. James had come by once more, bringing food from his wife, but he had said little. The silence from the rest of the family was louder than any argument. Thomas understood what it meant. They were distancing themselves, preparing to claim ignorance if the covenant demanded retribution. He didn't blame them. Survival had always been the first law of mountain families. Eleanor fed Daniel, sitting in the rocking chair that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother. The baby nursed contentedly, unaware of the tension that filled every corner of the house. Eleanor looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her face pale in the early morning light. She had barely eaten in 2 days, Her stomach twisted with anxiety. "I keep thinking about the story," she said quietly. "The first Calder, Ezekiel." Thomas turned from the window. "What about him?" "Pa told me once that Ezekiel came to this valley with nothing. He was running from something back east, some trouble with the law. He was desperate, hungry, probably half mad from traveling through wilderness, and he claimed something spoke to him from the river, offered him prosperity in exchange for sacrifice." "You think he made it up?" Thomas asked. "I think desperate men see what they want to see," Eleanor replied. "Maybe there was something there. Or maybe Ezekiel was just a man who found good land and created a story to explain his success. Stories have power, Thomas. People believe them, and belief can be more powerful than truth." "But the pattern holds," Thomas pointed out. "Every generation, the eldest Calder prospers. Farms that should fail somehow succeed. Children that should die from illness survive. That's more than just belief." "Is it, though?" Eleanor shifted Daniel to her shoulder, gently patting his back. "Or is it just confirmation bias? We remember the times the pattern holds and forget the times it doesn't. Your Aunt Catherine's firstborn died of fever at age 4. Your cousin Philip lost his farm in 1929, covenant or no covenant. Maybe the protection isn't as reliable as the family thinks." Thomas hadn't considered this. The family narrative emphasized the covenant's benefits, but Eleanor was right. There had been failures and tragedies despite the sacrifices. The Calders had survived, yes, but so had many other families who never drowned their children. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate. Thomas moved quickly to the door but didn't open it. Through the window he could see his father standing in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Thomas," Samuel called, "I need to talk to you. It's important." Thomas unlocked the door and opened it slightly. "Say what you need to say, Pa." Samuel looked older than he had 2 days ago, his face drawn and haggard. "I've been thinking about what you said, about William, about whether I killed him for nothing." His voice cracked slightly. "I want to show you something, down at the river." "I'm not taking Daniel anywhere near that river," Thomas said firmly. "Not Daniel, just you. Eleanor can stay here with the baby, please, son. There's something you need to see before tomorrow comes." Thomas looked back at Eleanor, who nodded slightly. He grabbed his coat and followed his father out into the bitter cold. They walked in silence through the dark woods, their boots crunching on frozen leaves. The river's sound grew louder as they approached, water rushing over stones despite the ice forming at the edges. Samuel led him to a spot where the river bent sharply, creating a deep pool. The water here was black and smooth, reflecting the last stars of morning. Samuel stood at the edge, staring into the depths. "This is where I brought William," he said. "Right here, 33 years ago. Dawn, just like tradition demands. I waded in up to my waist, holding him. He was crying, confused. He didn't understand. Samuel's voice was barely audible. And then I put him under." Thomas said nothing, letting his father speak. "I felt something," Samuel continued. "Like you said, maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was my mind trying to make sense of what I was doing. But I swear to you, Thomas, I felt something touch my leg under the water, something cold that wasn't the river. It wrapped around my ankle for just a moment, like fingers or tentacles. And then it was gone, and so was William." "Pa!" "I've come here every year on the anniversary," Samuel interrupted. "November 7th. I stand right here and I try to feel that presence again, to know if it was real. And sometimes, on certain nights when the moon is right, I see something moving under the water, something that shouldn't be there." Thomas looked into the dark pool, but saw nothing except his own reflection and his father's beside him. "Maybe you're right," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "Maybe I murdered my son for a story. Maybe Ezekiel was just a madman who convinced himself he'd made a deal with something supernatural. But Thomas, if there's even a chance it's real, can you risk it? Can you risk Eleanor, your future children, the whole family?" "I'm risking it all by breaking the covenant," Thomas acknowledged. "But I'm also risking it all by killing my son. If I do that, if I murder Daniel, I lose my humanity. I become something I can't live with." "Better to hate yourself and live than to die with a clear conscience," Samuel said. "Is it?" Thomas asked. "Have you been living, Pa? Or have you just been existing, haunted by what you did?" Samuel had no answer. They stood together in the pre-dawn cold, father and son, separated by an act committed 33 years ago and a decision that had to be made tomorrow. Finally, Samuel turned away from the river. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said, "I'll be watching from the house. If you change your mind, I'll go with you. Help you do what needs to be done, but if you don't—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. They walked back to the farmhouse together. The sun was rising now, turning the frozen valley gold and orange. It should have been beautiful, but to Thomas it felt like a countdown. One more sunrise, and then everything would change, one way or another. Eleanor was waiting inside, Daniel asleep in the cradle. She looked at Thomas's face and knew whatever his father had shown him hadn't changed his mind. Relief and terror mixed in her expression. They had one more day to prepare, one more day to be a family, before they defied 200 years of tradition and faced whatever consequences might follow. Outside, the Blackwater River continued its ancient flow, cold and dark and patient. The seventh day dawned cold and clear. Thomas woke before sunrise, his body tense with anticipation despite having barely slept. Beside him, Eleanor lay curled on her side, her breathing shallow and irregular. He knew she wasn't sleeping either. They had spent the night listening to every sound, every creak of the old house, expecting something to happen even before the appointed hour arrived. Daniel slept peacefully in his cradle, undisturbed by the weight of tradition that pressed down on his parents. Thomas rose quietly and dressed, then moved to the window. Outside, frost covered everything in silver. The valley looked pristine and beautiful, untouched by human darkness. But Thomas knew his father would be watching from somewhere, waiting to see if he would honor the covenant. Eleanor sat up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "It's time," she said simply. "Yes," Thomas replied. "The sun will be up in 20 minutes. By tradition, I should be at the river now." They looked at each other, and in that moment, they both understood what they were choosing. Not just Daniel's life, but a future of uncertainty. They were severing themselves from 200 years of family history, from whatever protection the covenant had provided, real or imagined. They were stepping into unknown territory with nothing but their conviction that some lines should never be crossed. Thomas lifted Daniel from the cradle. The baby stirred, opening his eyes briefly before settling back into sleep. His trust was absolute, his vulnerability complete. This was what the river had demanded for generations, innocent life offered without resistance. Thomas felt rage building in his chest at the very thought. "We're not going to the river," he said aloud, making it official. "We're keeping our son. Whatever comes, we face it together." Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but of relief and fear intermingled. They had made their choice, and now they would live with the consequences. The sun broke over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. The appointed hour had passed. For the first time in 233 years, a Calder Firstborn had not been offered to the river. Thomas waited, his heart pounding, expecting something to happen immediately. Thunder, perhaps, or the sound of rushing water, some sign that the covenant had been broken and retribution was coming, but nothing happened. The house remained quiet. Birds began their morning songs outside. Daniel yawned and made hungry sounds, oblivious to the momentous nature of the day. "Maybe it's over," Eleanor whispered. "Maybe we're free." Thomas wanted to believe her, but years of family stories had instilled a deep wariness. "Or maybe it's just beginning," he said. "Pa said the river always collects its due. It might not be immediate." They spent the day in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every sound. James came by around noon, bringing food and checking on them. His face was pale, his manner nervous. "Pa's beside himself," James reported. "He's been down at the river since dawn watching, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, he just stood there, staring at the water like he was waiting for it to speak." "What about you?" Thomas asked his brother. "What do you think?" James looked at Daniel, now awake and nursing at Eleanor's breast. "I think you're braver than I could ever be," he said quietly. Or maybe more foolish, I honestly don't know which, but I admire you for it, Thomas, even if I'm terrified of what might come. As evening fell, Thomas stood once again at the window, watching darkness claim the valley. The day had passed without incident. No supernatural retribution. No signs from the river. Perhaps the covenant had always been nothing more than superstition, a story that had grown in the telling until it became indistinguishable from truth. But in the depths of the Blackwater River, something ancient stirred, something that had feasted on Calder blood for generations. It had felt the breaking of the covenant, and it was patient. The river had time. It always collected what it was owed one way or another. The only question was when and what form the collection would take. Thomas didn't know this yet. For now, he held his son and dared to hope they had escaped the curse of the Calder line. 3 weeks passed without incident. Thomas began to relax, allowing himself to believe that perhaps the covenant had been nothing more than superstition after all. Daniel grew stronger, reaching the 1-month mark, healthy and thriving. Eleanor's color returned to her cheeks, and the house felt lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted from it. Samuel, however, deteriorated rapidly. He aged a decade in those 3 weeks, his face becoming gaunt, his movements slow and uncertain. He visited the house only once, briefly, to see his grandson. He had held Daniel awkwardly, as if afraid to damage something precious, then handed him back to Eleanor without a word. The look in his eyes had been complex. Fear, wonder, and something that might have been envy. "He wishes he'd had your courage," Eleanor said after Samuel left. "All these years, he's lived with what he did to William. Now he sees it didn't have to be that way." Thomas felt a complicated mixture of pity and anger toward his father. Part of him wanted to comfort the old man, to absolve him of guilt, but another part remained furious that Samuel had killed his own child based on nothing more than a story passed down through generations. The community of Davis began to hear whispers of what Thomas had done. News traveled slowly in the mountains, but it traveled. Some neighbors looked at the Calders with horror, certain they had brought disaster upon themselves. Others showed quiet support, perhaps secretly glad that someone had finally challenged the old ways. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, slipped extra supplies into Eleanor's purchases without charging for them. "My grandmother was a Calder," Mrs. Henderson confided quietly one day. "She married out of the family, but she knew the stories. She always said it was an abomination, what they did. I'm glad someone finally had the spine to stop it." But not everyone was supportive. Reverend Morris, the Baptist preacher who served 3 small churches in the valley, came to call one cold December afternoon. He sat in the Calder kitchen, refusing offered coffee, his Bible clutched in gnarled hands. "Thomas," he began, his voice grave, "you've broken a covenant. Not just a family tradition, but a spiritual contract. Whatever your grandfather and his forefathers agreed to, it was binding. You can't simply walk away from such things without consequences." "What kind of God would demand the sacrifice of children?" Thomas asked bluntly. "Not God," Reverend Morris said. "That's my point. Your ancestor made a pact with something else, something that predates Christianity in these mountains, the old things, Thomas. They don't forget and they don't forgive." "Then I'll face whatever comes," Thomas replied, "but I won't murder my son to appease a demon or spirit, or whatever Ezekiel thought he bargained with." The Reverend left, shaking his head. After he was gone, Eleanor turned to Thomas. "Do you think he's right? That Ezekiel made a deal with something evil?" "I think Ezekiel was desperate and possibly insane," Thomas said. "And I think 9 generations of Calders have perpetuated his madness. We're ending it. That's all that matters." But that night, things began to change. Thomas woke to the sound of water dripping. He rose from bed and followed the sound to Daniel's room. Water was seeping up through the floorboards, pooling around the cradle. Impossible. The house was built on high ground, nowhere near the river. Yet there it was, cold and dark, smelling of river mud and decay. Thomas grabbed Daniel and backed away as the water continued to rise. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her hand over her mouth in horror. The water reached several inches deep, then stopped, as suddenly as it had begun. It remained there unmoving for several minutes. Then it began to recede, flowing back through the floorboards until the room was dry again. No natural process could explain what they had witnessed. The river, it seemed, had found a way to reach them even in the supposed safety of their home. Thomas checked on Daniel, who had somehow slept through the entire event. Then he and Eleanor sat awake for the rest of the night, watching the floor, waiting for the water to return. "It's starting," Eleanor whispered. "The river is coming for what it's owed." Thomas held her close, his mind racing. They couldn't stay in the house if the river could reach them here, but where could they go? How did you escape from something that could defy the laws of nature? As dawn broke, Thomas made a decision. They would fight, not run, not hide, but stand their ground and protect their son against whatever the river sent. He had broken the covenant. Now he would face the consequences, but on his own terms. Whatever came next, the Calders would face it as a family. The manifestations continued over the following days, each more disturbing than the last. Eleanor would find wet footprints leading from nowhere to Daniel's cradle. Small footprints the size of a child's. The temperature in Daniel's room would plummet without explanation, their breath fogging even when the rest of the house remained warm. And always the sound of water dripping and flowing where no water should be. Thomas refused to give in to fear. He moved Daniel's cradle into their bedroom and slept with one eye open, ready to defend his son. Eleanor began wearing a silver cross her mother had given her, praying prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. They were grasping at anything that might offer protection. Samuel appeared at their door on the 5th day after the first manifestation. He looked even worse than before, his skin grey, his hands shaking. "It's getting worse," he said without preamble. "The whole family is experiencing things. James's eldest daughter nearly drowned in her bath yesterday. The tub was only half full, but something held her head under. James got to her in time, but Thomas, it's not just coming for Daniel, it's punishing all of us." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had anticipated consequences for himself and his immediate family, but not for the extended Calders. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Give it what it's owed," Samuel said desperately. "Before someone dies, before it takes more than just Daniel." "No," Thomas said firmly, "I won't kill my son. There has to be another way." "What other way?" Samuel practically shouted. "You think you can negotiate with something like this? You think you can reason with it? The covenant is broken, Thomas. The only way to restore it is to complete the sacrifice." Eleanor stepped forward, Daniel in her arms. "Or we end it permanently," she said. "Not by giving in, but by breaking its power completely." Both men looked at her. She had been thinking about this, Thomas could tell. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "Every covenant has terms. Ezekiel agreed to something, and that something has held power over the Calders ever since. But what if we could break the original agreement, undo whatever Ezekiel did?" "How?" Samuel asked skeptically. "Ezekiel's journal," Eleanor said. "I've heard the stories. He kept a record of everything." "Where is it?" Samuel was silent for a long moment. Finally he spoke. "It's been kept in the family safe for generations. I've read it once, years ago, before I performed the ritual with William. It described the covenant, how Ezekiel made it, what he promised." "And?" Thomas pressed. "And there was something about ending it," Samuel admitted reluctantly. "A way out if anyone was ever desperate enough to try it. But Ezekiel warned against it, said the price of breaking the covenant was higher than maintaining it." "What price could be higher than murdering children?" Eleanor demanded. Samuel met her eyes. "The one who breaks it must take the place of all who were sacrificed. He must go to the river willingly and give himself completely. Not just his life, but his soul. Everything that he is consumed by whatever lives in that water." The room fell silent. Thomas understood immediately. If he wanted to save Daniel, to end the covenant forever, he would have to sacrifice himself. Not a quick death, but something worse, an eternal consumption by the entity Ezekiel had bargained with. "Show me the journal," Thomas said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "Thomas, don't do this. Just give it Daniel. You can have other children. The covenant only requires the firstborn." "Show me the journal, Pa," Thomas repeated, his voice hard. An hour later, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, reading Ezekiel Calder's cramped handwriting by lamplight. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, but the words were clear. Ezekiel had been running from murder charges in Massachusetts when he stumbled into this valley in 1702. Starving, desperate, he had fallen to his knees at the river's edge and begged for help. Something had answered. The entity identified itself only as the Old One of the Water. It offered Ezekiel prosperity, protection, and a long line of descendants. In exchange, every generation would feed it the firstborn of the eldest son. The child's innocent life would sustain it, keep it strong, allow it to maintain its hold on this place. But Ezekiel had been cunning. He had negotiated an escape clause, perhaps sensing that one day someone in his line might want to break free. The covenant could be dissolved if any Calder chose to offer himself completely, life, soul, and essence, in place of all who had been sacrificed before. The Old One would accept this trade, releasing the family from the bargain, but the one who made the exchange would cease to exist in any meaningful way. Not dead, but consumed, used as fuel for the entity's continued existence. Thomas closed the journal and looked at Eleanor. She was crying silently, understanding what he was about to do. "There's another way," she pleaded. "There has to be." But Thomas knew there wasn't. He could live with the guilt of breaking the covenant, but not with the guilt of causing harm to innocent nieces and nephews, not with watching the entity hunt his family one by one, and certainly not with sacrificing Daniel. "I love you," he said to Eleanor. "Raise Daniel well. Tell him his father loved him." Then he walked out into the December night, heading for the river. Thomas stood at the edge of the Blackwater River as dawn approached, the same spot where his father had sacrificed William 33 years ago, the same spot where 9 generations of Calder firstborns had been fed to the water. But Thomas was not carrying an infant. He was offering himself. Samuel had followed him, standing some distance back, his face etched with anguish. Eleanor had wanted to come, but Thomas had forbidden it. This was something he needed to do alone. He had left her in the house with Daniel, made her promise to stay there no matter what she heard or saw. The journal had been specific about the ritual. Thomas needed to enter the water willingly, speaking the words of dissolution that Ezekiel had recorded. He needed to call the Old One forth and make the exchange explicit. Most importantly, he needed to mean it. Half measures wouldn't work. He had to genuinely surrender everything he was. Thomas waded into the river. The water was shockingly cold, numbing his legs almost immediately. He kept walking until he was waist-deep, standing where Samuel had stood decades ago, where Ezekiel himself might have stood when making the original bargain. "I call upon the Old One of the Water," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I offer myself in place of all who were sacrificed. I break the covenant made by Ezekiel Calder. Take me and release my family." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water around Thomas began to move, swirling in patterns that defied the current. Something rose from the depths, not breaking the surface, but visible beneath it, a dark shape, massive and ancient. Thomas felt its attention focus on him, alien and hungry. A voice spoke, not in his ears, but directly in his mind. It was old beyond comprehension, cold as the depths of the deepest ocean. "You would trade yourself for the covenant breakers? You would surrender your soul for the child you refused to give?" "Yes," Thomas said without hesitation. "Take me. Let Daniel and all future Calders go free." "The bargain was good," the voice said. "Fresh, innocent life, generation after generation. You offer one adult life, already tainted by experience and choice. Why should I accept this trade?" Thomas hadn't expected negotiation. "Because I offer it willingly," he said. "The children were taken by force, by fear. I give myself freely. That must have value." The water swirled faster, and Thomas felt something wrap around his ankles, cold and strong. "You understand there is no return, no afterlife, no rest. You will become part of me, fuel for my existence. You will be aware but powerless, consumed slowly over centuries." Thomas thought of Daniel, sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's arms. He thought of his unborn future children who would now have a chance at life. He thought of breaking the cycle that had haunted his family for 200 years. "I understand," he said. "I accept." The entity paused, and Thomas sensed something like surprise from it. In 2 centuries, no Calder had been willing to make this trade. They had all chosen to maintain the covenant rather than sacrifice themselves to end it. "Very well," the voice said finally. "The bargain is made, the covenant is dissolved. But know this, Thomas Calder, your sacrifice will be remembered by the water. Your name will be spoken by the river itself when others pass by. You chose love over survival, and that choice has power." Thomas felt the grip on his ankles tighten. The water began to pull him down, not violently, but inexorably. He took a last breath and looked back at the shore. Samuel was on his knees, weeping. Beyond him, the sky was turning pink with dawn. As the water closed over his head, Thomas felt himself dissolving, his consciousness fragmenting and being absorbed by something vast and ancient. There was pain, but also a strange peace. He had saved his son. He had broken the curse. Whatever came next, the Calders were free. On the shore, Samuel watched until there was nothing left to see but the river flowing as it always had. When he finally turned back toward the house, the sun was fully up. He would have to tell Eleanor. He would have to raise Daniel with the knowledge of what his father had done. But the covenant was broken. The sacrifices were ended. Thomas had paid the ultimate price to ensure that no Calder child would ever be fed to the river again. Years later, Eleanor would remarry and have 3 more children. Daniel would grow up to become a teacher, leaving West Virginia for a quiet life in Ohio. He would have 4 children of his own, all of whom would live full lives. The Calder family would continue, but the darkness that had haunted them for centuries was gone. Sometimes, on certain nights when the moon was right, locals walking near the Blackwater River would hear a voice in the water. It spoke only one word over and over, like a prayer or a remembrance: Thomas. The river itself kept his memory alive, honoring the man who had chosen to die so others might live free. And in the depths of the water, Thomas Calder's consciousness remained, aware and accepting. He had made his choice. He had broken the covenant. His son lived, and that was enough. That would always be enough. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.